Welcome to Poetic Technique. Today we'll be talking about the prose poem. So what is a prose poem? Well, in short, a prose poem is any unlineated poem. It's a block of text, either a paragraph or a few paragraphs. It can be one paragraph long, or it can last about 3 or 4 pages at most, usually. And what differentiates it from the poetry that we're used to seeing is that it doesn't have line breaks. It has just that block of text. It's not left aligned, it's not right aligned, it's not centered on the page, it's justified text so that the margins are even on either side. I feel like a stewardess when I do this. Okay, so we can look at people like Matsuo Basho, whose haibun sequences, which are a short block of prose poem and then haiku, typified this genre in Japan in his Narrow Road to the Deep North. Or we can look at the French decadents, who we typically think of in association with the prose poem, the way that they wrote poems that subverted expectations for the genre of poetry. Or we can think about American modernists, people like Gertrude Stein, the way that they wrestled with how you can work poetic language into a poem, no matter its form, so we don't have to rely on the line anymore. We can create these chunks of text that create their own internal logic, their own internal musical propulsions, for example. There are a couple of quotes that I'd like to share with you to get us thinking about what the prose poem can be and do. The first comes from Mallarmé, and it's a slightly longer quote, so bear with me here. Mallarmé says, "Verse is everywhere in language where there is rhythm. Everywhere. Except on posters and page 4 of the newspapers. In the genre of which we call prose, there is verse of every conceivable rhythm, some of it admirable. But in reality, there is no prose. There is the alphabet, and then there are verse forms, more or less rigid, more or less diffuse. In every attempt at style, there is versification." At every attempt at style, there is versification, says Mallarmé. And then Molière says, "All that is not prose is verse, and all that is not verse is prose." Baudelaire himself wanted to come up with a definition of the genre. What he said is the miracle of poetic prose, musical, though rhythmless and rhymeless, flexible, yet rugged enough to identify with the lyrical impulses of the soul, the ebbs and the flows of reverie, the pangs of consciousness. The reason I wanted us to start with the prose poem as the first genre that we look at in this class is because we can think about so many different ways that meaning is made in our language. So many different aspects of language, from grammatical mood to tense, for example, to point of view that we use in a poem. All of these different aspects of language contribute to the way that we make meaning. And so does line. But in order to understand or to get an appreciation for line, I thought it would be best if we focus on the other bits first, and maybe we can identify some of the reasons people might choose to break a line at this word versus that word. Let's head back home and get an idea of what's happening in that first poem. We're going to read it really closely, line by line, look at some of the different movements of language that we see there. Okay, let's tuck into our poems for the day. Go ahead and open up your packet of prose poems, that should be week 1, and also open up the handout called Trappings of a Poem. Both of these should be available in links below as well as on Canvas. So on that handout, you're going to notice there's a section called Organizational Principles. We'll be briefly discussing 3 of those today, including musicality, grammatical mood, and point of view, as they pertain especially to Franz Wright's poem. I'd encourage you to apply what we discussed today in Wright's poem to the other readings that we've done. So let's get started. Okay, let's dig into our packet and start with the Franz Wright poem. Honestly, this is my second time recording this portion of the video. Don't make fun of me, but like my last recording was fine. I just love this poem so much that I had to do it again. Okay, so I'm reading out of Franz Wright's Kindertotenwald, which is a prose poems collection. That's where this one comes from. We'll be looking at Brothers. Now I'm going to go ahead and read through it, and what I want you to do is don't try to make sense out of it. Don't try to figure it out. Don't even bother with what the words mean at this point. The only thing I want you to do is listen to the sounds. Brothers. So I went out among the dead, a pint of whiskey in my head, and lay down between graves in the snow, and closing my eyes to the blowing snow, looked into his eyes, the ruined teeth, the wincing smile. No one is lost in his own eyes. From our own unique viewpoint, we are never lost, and the lost too love their lives. They hate their lives and want to die, but they too are attached to themselves, know any number of good things regarding that entity nobody else could know, their gaze fixed on a past like no other, a place where there's a hope they still remember, still hold on to. We cannot see ourselves as lost, though anyone else can, and will jump at the chance to point it out. We do not see ourselves at all, mercifully. Know what it feels like when you're looked at with love or simple kindness? I look at him as if he were a stain. I can feel it eat away, a place to live inside my heart that's getting larger all the time, for I am just like him, but luckier. Luckier to a degree I would call an atrocity. And if so much luckier, why do I not spend some time to understand and befriend him once more, as in childhood, for a few years? Barely awake, before you can even open your eyes, you know what has happened. You sit up in bed and spend the next couple of hours wondering how you were going to get from your bed to the bathroom, and that is just the beginning. You would really rather sleep. You start to like sleep more and more. I wish I could be clearer about the horror. But that very term instantly causes the others to glance at each other, suppress a knowing smile, and get away from us as fast as they can. Before they do, though, this time, I want one of them to tell me who was in charge of tracking my brother's swift progress sleepward and evermore winterward. Footprints suddenly come to an end, like an unfinished sentence in the diary of an elderly teenager working the night shift alone, held up at gunpoint and abruptly deceased halfway across a black snowfield, right outside Reno, Nevada at 4 in the morning our time. People don't just disappear. Look at me and understand me. People don't just disappear, do they? Not without leaving a stain. Oh yes, the others are going to want to get away from us, and they do, every last one of them. And I am so sorry for you. One would imagine that knowing firsthand what you go through, I might be of more help, but I will abandon you too. So what do we hear? What do we hear in this poem? Well, right from the start, we've got exact rhyme. Let me find my pencil and point some of these things out. We've got exact rhyme, which is going to signal to us a heightened attention to language. And then we have identical rhyme, which is what it's called when you use the same word twice. So dead, head, exact, same vowel sounds. Snow, snow, identical, the exact same word. And then we have exact rhyme again, which is when we have no change to the vowel sound. The eyes, the smile, I smile, eyes again, some more identical rhyme. So immediately when we start this poem, so I went out among the dead, a pint of whiskey in my head, we hear its meter, which is that ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. We hear that meter, and we hear the exact rhyme sounds, the identical rhyme sounds, and then it keeps going with these types of devices. We have assonance, alliteration, consonants, many other things. And I want to shift and talk not just about the musicality of the poem, but next about the grammatical moods. And so a brief kind of reminder of common grammatical moods. These are things that we use every day. We might not know the language for them, but these are parts of speech that we use every day. Some of the most common include the following. That's a grammatical, that's what that says, I promise. We have the indicative. These are for declarative statements. This is the thing happened, basically. And that doesn't mean that the thing is necessarily true. It's just a statement. It's presented as a declaration, an indication of a thing. This is what Wright uses mostly in this poem. I went out among the dead. This is what I did. A pint of whiskey in my head. That's my condition. And lay down between the graves and the snow. That's the same thing. And then we have what's called the interrogative. And this is asking a question. We'll look at the two examples of questions in this poem here in just a moment. We have the imperative. This is a command or a request. And then we have the subjunctive. This refers to a possibility or a hypothetical. So these are super common grammatical moods, and every one of them is used in this poem to differing effect. First one that we discussed is the indicative, and that constitutes the bulk of this poem. The second one that we see is, begins, where is it? Begins right here. We're moving from all of these declarative statements, image to image, idea to idea. This first section concerns these kind of broad abstractions. You've got the speaker is at a grave thinking about things. No one is lost in his own eyes. The lost two left their lives. He's thinking. He's had a pint of whiskey. And then we have this sudden shift using the interrogative. Know what it feels like when you're looked at with love or simple kindness? And that changes the way that the poem feels. It changes the way that we hear the poem. And this shift, quick side note, add this to your vocab sheet. A volta is a shift in a poem. So a sonnet, for example, has a volta after the first section. In this poem, I see a couple of voltas or a couple of shifts. The first one is with this interrogative. Know what it feels like, etc. And this shift goes from the thinking to how the speaker feels about his brother, how his brother's absence impacts him. I look at him as if he were a stain. I can feel it eat away a place to live inside my heart that's getting larger all the time. Another way that Wright emphasizes the fact there's a shift here is he introduces a new vowel sound or a new vowel rhyme. We have stain, away, place, and then we have another one, heart, larger. So this isn't a poem that's broken into lines, and yet we see all of the trappings of poetry that we're familiar with, internal rhymes and such. So we have this shift from the declarative to the interrogative that's further emphasized with new vowel sounds or new vowel rhymes. And then we have another shift almost directly after, and that's right here. A second example of, what is this? Yes, the interrogative. So we have a second interrogative. And this second shift is signaled by a switch in point of view. So far, we've been talking, and the speaker's been talking in the first person. I went out, etc. Now we have a shift into the second person before you can even open your eyes. So what's happening here? Barely awake, before you can even open your eyes, you know what has happened. You sit up in bed and spend the next couple hours wondering how you were going to get from your bed to the bathroom. And that is just the beginning. You would really rather sleep. You start to like sleep and more. I wish I could be clear about the horror. Okay, so this right here, this section before we switch back to the first person singular, is an example of something. It's illustrating something. Now what Wright does pretty masterfully for the argument of this poem, or for the multiple arguments of this poem, is he leaves this you ambiguous. So the you could be referring to the brother. He could be directly addressing his brother here. Alternatively, the you could be just someone the speaker interacts with, someone he encounters later on. The way that I tend to read it is the you is both. So the final drama of the poem is the deliberate ambiguity of Wright's use of the second person. The you in this poem could be read as his brother, could be read as an unspecified addressee, or it could be both. And because Wright makes the you ambiguous, I take it to mean both. So this is what I read as a sort of odic meditation on his brother's death and what that means to him, how he, with whiskey in his head, signals the significance of this event. It indicates something that the speaker believes about himself. Looking at these parts of speech, looking at the common grammatical moods, looking at the way that these shifts are further emphasized in the very musicality of the language and these new rhymes, it helps us to understand things that we might otherwise not be able to apprehend. And I don't know if understand is actually the right word, but to start to appreciate or to start to experience or maybe feel our way through, suss our way through. these, looking at the poem in terms of these structural elements that are introduced in your trappings handout might be a helpful starting point. So when we get to something like this at the end, we can make a little bit more sense out of it. If the speaker believes that he will abandon you too, as he states that he abandoned his brother, we start to question whether or not we can believe him. He is, after all, at the graveside after a few drinks. But we have a little bit better of a sense of who this you might be. He can't abandon his brother. His brother's already dead. He might be able to abandon other people. We get the feeling then that in this meditation, the speaker feels a sense of regret. He contradicts himself throughout the poem, but he feels a sense of regret, and he thinks that the way that he abandoned his brother might be indicative of who he is. So we get to know his psychology a little bit better. All right, I hope I haven't over-explained or ruined the poem by my own reading. One of the points that I want to drive home is that these structural elements that we use to interpret a poem are ways to dive into, but not ways to kind of exclusively narrow in on a meaning. Again, one of the greatest strengths of this poem's argument is the ambiguity. We don't know who the you is exactly, and so the poem opens up to multiple readings, to multiple meanings. Okay, I'm going to see if I've noted everything that I want to. Are there a couple of things that I didn't know? I think I said that there were 2 instances of the interrogative. There's a third right here, so excuse me if I did. And this kind of brings us home. This is the third example of the interrogative in this poem. And we know that the poem is coming to its conclusion. It signals that final shift. So this might be what one considered like a central aspect of the argument. The one thing that I haven't talked about is, I believe, the imperative. Right here. Look at me and understand me. We've talked about all of the different shifts that we've seen through other grammatical moods, but what happens when we have this? You know, we've had a few different feelings. The speaker has felt a certain way throughout this poem. And then we get here, we're given an example of a tragedy, of a death. And then this declarative statement, people don't just disappear, followed up with, look at me and understand me. And then it's repeated, but in a different grammatical mood. People don't just disappear, do they? Well, my God. I mean, not only are we driving this point home, but we're switching it up through repetition and through different grammatical moods for different emotional effect. Look at me and understand me. God, that just feels so heavy. I think that's all that I want to say about this poem. I don't want to ruin the poem by over-explicating it. So I'm going to look very briefly at another poem that we have in our packet for today. This one is by Hala Ayan. So, in Hala Ayan's poem, The Length Between July and October, I just want to look at a couple of images. Note that there are some shifts in grammatical mood, much like in the right poem, and that there are shifts in point of view. So if you will, let's look at the way that image is a driving force for this poem. The Length Between July and October is a poem, knees on wooden floors, the sun like a porch light upon your hands. Baba girl, the tree made a silhouette against the house. I counted the branches in the shadow. The morning is nothing more than your mother's voice and the bedsheets imprinting your body like fresh snow. How many images have been packed into just these first 4 lines? In addition to that, we have these multiple shifts in grammatical mood and shifts in point of view. Even this I learned from you, addressed to Baba girl. The perfect mouth of a beer bottle, another image. Haircut over a trash can, another image. And then this shift, Habibti, excuse me, give me the good mushrooms. So now we have a command. So go ahead and look through the other poems in this packet, just reread them, and see if you can't identify some of these shifts. Coming back to the 4 moods, we've identified the indicative, interrogative, imperative, and subjunctive. Coming back to this idea of image as a central building block of the poem. And also taking into mind musicality as a general way to organize a poem. What do you notice that you hadn't noticed before? What are some entry points for you now that we're using this language to discuss the poetry that we're reading? All right, well, that's it for this week. Don't forget you have 2 things due Friday by midnight. The first thing being your notes, as well as any questions that you have about what we discussed this week. And the other thing being your image vase. I've got my makeshift image vase somewhere over here. There it is. This little booger. Just 2 images in there. You will need more than 2 images. You're going to need, let's see, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 10 images. And remember, this first week, you're culling those from the readings, from the packets. So 2 per day from the readings that we've done. And beginning Saturday, you'll be collecting images from out of your own life, your own surroundings, and your own research. As concerns the discussion board, I'd like you to think of this as a space not only to put down your notes about the subjects at hand, but also to ask questions of your peers and ask questions of me that you might have about how to dig deeper into the readings that we have or the subjects that we've discussed. And if you want to add any resources you found, say you have an interview or a link concerning image and poetry that you found really, really useful, if you want to share that stuff, awesome. That'd be really cool. This is going to be the primary space that we have to talk. It's the closest thing that we'll have to a discussion outside of these videos. So please think of it as the conversational space. Include your notes, sure. But also let's engage each other as much as possible there. Okay, well that's it. I'll see you next week. Not sure what we're doing at this moment, but we'll have a good time. Bye.